13 black celebrities who were the most dangerous criminals.
Arrested Kelly in Chicago.
They had the money, the fame, the applause, and the kind of public admiration most people only dream about. But behind the trophies hit records, and red carpets were arrests, prison sentences, violent accusations, and criminal cases that shattered everything they built. Some lost their freedom, some lost their careers, and some lost the right to ever be seen the same way again. Tonight we're uncovering 13 black celebrities whose legal downfalls changed their legacy forever. Before we begin, subscribe to the Black Excellence list, because these are not just celebrity stories. They are cautionary tales about power, fame, and the price of falling in public. O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson belongs in this video because no other story on this list shows the collision of fame, law, and public memory quite like his. He was not simply a former star with a criminal case. He became the center of one of the most watched legal dramas in American history. In June 1994, after the killings of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, Simpson was arrested and charged with both murders. The case that followed was televised, dissected, and argued over across the country until a jury acquitted him in October 1995. That legal outcome matters, and it must be stated clearly. He was not convicted in criminal court for those killings. But the story did not end there. In a 1997 civil trial, Simpson was found liable for the deaths and ordered to pay $33.5 million to the families. That is what makes his story so difficult and so powerful. O.J. Simpson's downfall cannot be told as a simple conviction story because it was never simple. It was a national fracture point about race, celebrity policing, and justice. Even after the acquittal, the public never moved on. His name remained tied to the case in a way that swallowed nearly everything that came before it. Football greatness, broadcasting endorsements, even the carefully built image of crossover American success. The law had spoken in two different ways, and the country kept arguing in between them. How many public figures are remembered less for what they achieved than for what the nation still believes about them? Then came the second collapse. In 2008, Simpson was convicted in Las Vegas on charges including armed robbery and kidnapping, stemming from a 2007 hotel room confrontation over sports memorabilia. He received a sentence with a minimum of 9 years and a maximum of 33 years, served about 9 years, and was granted parole in 2017. That conviction turned a man once associated with scandal and suspicion into a man with an undisputed prison record. That is why O.J. Simpson fits this title so well. His story is not just about one case. It is about a public life that never escaped the courtroom and a legacy permanently split between acquittal, civil liability, and eventual criminal conviction. R. Kelly. R. Kelly's chapter belongs in this video because his collapse was not built on rumor, image damage, or a single reckless incident. It became a matter of courtroom record. For years, he occupied a towering place in American R&B with a catalog that reached radio weddings, school graduations, church programs, and arenas across the country. That is what makes the ending of his story so jarring. The same fame that once insulated him eventually became central to the government's case against him. In September 2021, a federal jury in Brooklyn found Robert Sylvester Kelly guilty on all 9 counts, including racketeering and violations tied to the sexual exploitation of children and women. In June 2022, he was sentenced there to 30 years in prison. What gives this story its real weight is the pattern prosecutors described. This was not presented as a brief lapse in judgment. Federal authorities argued that Kelly used his celebrity money employees and access to create a structure that helped him control and isolate victims over a long period of time, and the jury accepted that theory. Then came another major legal blow. In September 2022, a federal jury in Chicago convicted him on child pornography and enticement charges. In February 2023, he received an additional 20-year sentence with 19 years running concurrently with the New York term and 1 year consecutive. How does a man go from shaping the soundtrack of an era to being remembered chiefly through federal convictions? That question sits at the center of why this story hits so hard. The answer is not just fame, temptation, or ego. It is the devastating gap between public adoration and private harm. In February 2025, a federal appeals court upheld his New York convictions and sentence, making clear that this downfall was not some temporary public storm waiting to pass. That is why R. Kelly stands near the top of any list like this. His legacy was not merely bruised, it was fundamentally rewritten. In the end, the records that once made him powerful no longer carried the final authority. The verdicts did. Wesley Snipes. Wesley Snipes belongs in this story because his collapse did not come from a violent scandal, a tabloid affair, or a single explosive arrest. It came from something colder, and in its own way more unsettling: the slow destruction of credibility. By the early 2000s, Snipes had already built one of the strongest screen personas in Hollywood. He was not just a working actor. He was the face of disciplined power in films like Blade: New Jack City and White Men Can't Jump. That is exactly why his legal downfall hit so hard. It did not merely interrupt a career. It changed the way the public read the man behind the image. The core of the case was federal tax law. In February 2008, a jury found Snipes guilty on 3 misdemeanor counts of willful failure to file federal income tax returns for 1999, 2000, and 2001. Just as importantly, he was acquitted of the more serious felony charges of conspiracy to defraud the government and filing a false claim. That distinction matters because his story is strongest when it is told precisely. Then in April 2008, a federal judge sentenced him to 3 years in prison, and after appeals, he began serving that sentence in 2010 before being released in 2013. How does an actor who once looked untouchable end up defined by paperwork, court dates, and a prison term? That question is what gives Wesley Snipes' story its force. His downfall was not dramatic in the usual Hollywood sense. It was procedural, legal, relentless. There were no flashing headlines about bloodshed or street violence, just the steady unraveling of authority. And that made it feel even more sobering. A man whose screen presence suggested total control was suddenly standing inside a case built on non-compliance, misjudgment, and the government's insistence that fame did not place him above obligation. That is why Wesley Snipes fits this title so well. His legacy was not erased, but it was altered. The prison sentence became part of the story every time his name came up. In the end, the damage was not only legal, it was symbolic. He had spent years portraying men who mastered danger. Then real life exposed a different kind of vulnerability, one that no action role could outrun. Lil Wayne. Lil Wayne's story belongs in this video because his fall did not come from one chaotic headline that vanished the next week. It came from a moment that permanently altered how the public viewed him. By the late 2000s, he was no longer just a successful rapper, he was the center of rap's commercial universe. The Carter III had become the best-selling album in the United States in 2008. And at the 2009 Grammys, it won Best Rap Album, while helping confirm Wayne as the dominant voice of his era. That is what made the legal trouble hit with such force. He was not climbing when it happened. He was already at the top. The turning point came from a 2007 New York gun case. Prosecutors said a firearm was found on his tour bus after a concert, and Wayne later pleaded guilty to attempted criminal possession of a weapon under a deal that spared him more serious exposure at trial. In 2010, he was sentenced to 1 year in jail and ultimately served about 8 months at Rikers Island before being released in November 2010. Legally, the case was straightforward. Symbolically, it was devastating. The image of Lil Wayne shifted from untouchable superstar to artist in a jail uniform while his career was still blazing. What does it do to a legend when the world suddenly sees handcuffs where it once saw invincibility? That question is the center of Lil Wayne's story. The prison sentence did not erase his talent, and it did not end his career. In fact, while incarcerated, he still managed to release music, and the public saw proof that his commercial power had not completely disappeared. But that is not the same as escaping the stain. From that point on, his name carried more than a claim. It carried a record. Even later issues, including a separate federal gun case that ended with a presidential pardon in 2021, only reinforced how tightly legal trouble had wrapped itself around his public identity. That is why Lil Wayne fits this title so well. His story is not about talent vanishing. It is about greatness surviving while innocence does not. Once that line is crossed, the music can still be loud, but it never sounds quite as untouched again. Flavor Flav. Flavor. Flav's story hits differently because his downfall was never just about one arrest. It was about the unsettling gap between the character the public loved and the pattern the public kept trying not to see. For millions of people, Flav was the wild energy of Public Enemy, the man with the giant clock, the explosive ad-libs, the comic spark beside Chuck D's political fire. He helped make one of the most influential rap groups in American history, and that playful image stayed with him for decades. Even later, reality television turned him into something softer in the public imagination, chaotic, funny, impossible to ignore. That is exactly why the legal trouble around him feels so jarring. It forces people to look again. The core of his story is repetition. Long before reality TV made him seem almost harmless, Flav had already built a legal history that included violence, addiction, and instability. In 1991, he pleaded guilty to assaulting his then-girlfriend and served 30 days in jail. In 1993, he was charged in another violent incident and later entered treatment for crack cocaine addiction. Those were not isolated warning signs. They were early signals of a darker pattern beneath the public persona. That pattern became impossible to overlook again in 2012, when Flav was arrested in Las Vegas after a domestic dispute involving his fiancée's teenage son, with charges that included assault with a deadly weapon and domestic violence battery. In 2014, Reuters reported that he resolved the case by pleading guilty to lesser charges, receiving a 1-year suspended sentence and family counseling rather than prison time. How quickly does laughter change when the audience realizes the chaos was never only for show? That question is what gives Flavor Flav's story its force. He was not brought down by a single spectacular collapse. He was altered by accumulation. Every new case made the giant clock look less like harmless theater and more like camouflage for a man whose life kept slipping out of control. That is why his story belongs here. It changes the way you see him almost instantly, not because the entertainer disappears, but because the record behind the entertainer becomes impossible to ignore. Suge Knight. Suge Knight fits this title because his story was never just about legal trouble. It was about power curdling into fear. In the 1990s, Knight did not simply run Death Row Records. He helped shape one of the most explosive eras in hip-hop, standing behind artists like Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and Tupac Shakur. But even at the height of that success, his name carried something darker than industry influence. He was not merely seen as powerful. He was seen as dangerous. And over time, that reputation stopped feeling like myth and started becoming part of his public record. What makes Suge Knight's story so gripping is that the violence was not framed as one shocking break from character. It looked to many observers like the final expression of a pattern that had followed him for years. Long before the fatal 2015 case, Knight had already built a history of assault convictions, probation violations, and prison time. The public image surrounding him was never that of a businessman who occasionally stumbled. It was the image of a mogul whose power often seemed inseparable from intimidation. Then came January 29, 2015. After an argument connected to the Straight Outta Compton film set, Knight drove his truck into 2 men in a Compton burger stand parking lot, killing Terry Carter and injuring Clee Bone Sloan. He claimed self-defense. Prosecutors argued otherwise. In September 2018, just days before trial, Knight pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter and accepted a 28-year prison sentence to avoid the risk of life imprisonment. In October 2018, that sentence was formally imposed. What happens when the image of menace that once made a man seem untouchable becomes the very thing that destroys him? That question is the heart of Suge Knight's story. His fall feels so severe because it was not just the collapse of a celebrity. It was the collapse of a myth built on fear, influence, and force. In the end, the empire, the legend, and the aura all gave way to the plain finality of a prison sentence. For Suge Knight, power did not protect the legacy. It helped bury it. Fetty Wap. Fetty Wap's story hits hard because it feels like watching a light go out far too early. His rise was one of those rare moments in music that seemed almost effortless. Trap Queen turned him into a breakout star in 2015, and for a while he felt impossible to miss radio streaming clubs, festivals everywhere. What makes his fall so striking is not just that he got into trouble. It is that the trouble was serious enough to rewrite the public memory of a career that once looked built for longevity. The legal case against him was not framed as a celebrity misstep or a brief lapse in judgment. Federal prosecutors said Willie Jr. Maxwell II, the artist known as Fetty Wap, was part of a drug trafficking conspiracy that distributed more than 100 kilograms of cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, and crack cocaine across Long Island and New Jersey from about June 2019 through June 2020. Investigators said the organization used the U.S. Postal Service and vehicles with hidden compartments to move narcotics from the West Coast to the East Coast. Prosecutors described Fetty Wap as a kilogram-level redistributor within that operation. In August 2022, he pleaded guilty to conspiracy to distribute and possess controlled substances. And in May 2023, a federal judge sentenced him to 6 years in prison, followed by 5 years of post-release supervision. How does someone go from giving the world an anthem to becoming part of a federal trafficking case? That question is what gives Fetty Wap's story its sting. His downfall was not drawn out over decades. It came fast enough to feel shocking. One chapter was momentum, visibility, and promise. The next was indictment, plea sentencing, and prison. That speed changes how people see a star. It turns what once felt exciting into something sobering. Fetty Wap fits this title because his case was not just a setback. It became the event that redefined the arc of his public life. The fame is still part of the story, but now it has to stand beside the record. Cuba Gooding Jr. Cuba Gooding Jr.'s story lands with unusual force because it overturns an image many people thought they understood. For years, he was the smiling, high-energy presence audiences associated with warmth, charisma, and that unforgettable Oscar win for Jerry Maguire in 1997. He was not framed in the public imagination as menacing or volatile. He looked like one of Hollywood's most accessible stars. That is exactly why the collapse felt so jarring. It was not just a legal problem, it was a shock to the persona itself. The criminal case that most sharply changed his public standing grew out of allegations in New York. Prosecutors said accusations by 3 women formed the basis of a 6-count indictment involving claims of groping and unwanted kissing in Manhattan nightlife settings. In April 2022, Gooding pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor count of forcibly touching one woman, and the case was later resolved through a plea arrangement that ultimately left him with a non-criminal harassment violation, along with treatment requirements and no jail time. Reuters also reported that more than 30 women had accused him of misconduct in public settings over the years, deepening the damage far beyond a single courtroom file. That is what makes his story feel so unexpectedly heavy. This was not the kind of downfall driven by one explosive arrest and immediate disappearance. It unfolded through accumulation. Each allegation chipped away at the easy public reading of who he had been. The man once celebrated as a scene-stealing talent became instead a figure tied to the language of accusation, plea deals, and public distrust. In Hollywood, that shift can be more final than prison. A star can survive scandal if the audience still believes in the person beneath it. But once that belief starts to collapse, the damage spreads everywhere, casting reputation, memory, legacy. How unsettling is it when the person who once felt familiar on screen suddenly becomes someone the public no longer knows how to trust? That question is the emotional center of Cuba Gooding Jr.'s story. His fall was not only legal, it was psychological for the audience. It forced people to revisit a face they had once associated with celebration and ask whether they had ever really known what stood behind the performance at all. Chris Brown. Chris Brown's story shocks people not because they have never heard the name, but because they remember exactly what he once represented. Before the scandals hardened public opinion, he looked like the complete package: young, gifted, polished, charismatic, and seemingly built for a long reign. He was a teenage breakout with major hits, a dancer with crossover appeal, and one of the brightest young stars in R&B. That is what makes his fall so unsettling. The public did not watch an unknown figure self-destruct. It watched a golden boy become almost overnight a symbol of violence. The turning point came in February 2009, just hours before the Grammy Awards, when Brown assaulted Rihanna, then his girlfriend. In August 2009, he was sentenced to 5 years of probation and 180 days of community labor after pleading guilty. The court also ordered domestic violence counseling, and a restraining order was part of the aftermath. That case did more than create one headline. It permanently changed the emotional frame around his name. From that point on, every performance, every comeback attempt, and every chart success carried the memory of that assault behind it. How often does the public truly forgive when the image that shattered was once so clean? That question is the center of Chris Brown's story. Because the most surprising part is not that he survived commercially. In some ways, he did. His career continued, and he remained successful enough to win a Grammy again after the assault. But survival is not the same thing as restoration. By 2015, a judge finally ended his felony probation, closing the court supervision that had followed him for more than 6 years. Even then, the legal chapter may have formally closed, but the moral and cultural one did not. That is why Chris Brown belongs in a story like this. His downfall was not a brief scandal swallowed by time. It became a permanent split in how the public saw him: immense talent on one side, irreversible damage on the other. And that tension is what still makes his name so volatile. The music never stopped, but neither did the shadow. Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson's story remains so gripping because it feels like the collapse of something people once believed could not be broken. He was not just a boxer winning titles. He was a force of nature, young, terrifying, explosive, and so dominant that the public began to speak about him less like an athlete and more like a phenomenon. That is what makes the legal case that changed his life so difficult to look away from. When Tyson fell, he did not fall from the middle. He fell from the very top. The turning point came in 1991 when Desiree Washington, an 18-year-old beauty pageant contestant, accused Tyson of rape in an Indianapolis hotel room. In 1992, he was convicted and sentenced to 6 years in prison. He was released in 1995 after serving about 3 years. Those facts alone were enough to permanently divide public memory into two eras: the Tyson before the conviction and the Tyson after it. The man who had once looked physically unstoppable was now being spoken about in the language of courtrooms, punishment, and disgrace. What shocks people more than watching a champion lose? Watching him lose in a way that changes what his name means forever. That question sits at the heart of Mike Tyson's story. Because the most haunting part is not simply that he went to prison. It is that he returned and yet never truly came back as the same figure in the public imagination. Yes, he fought again. Yes, he won again. But the myth had been punctured. The old aura of invincibility had been replaced by something heavier and more tragic. Later years brought more instability, including a 2003 bankruptcy filing and additional legal troubles which only deepened the sense that the rise and the unraveling were now permanently linked. That is why Mike Tyson belongs on a list like this. His story is not just about talent meeting trouble. It is about a legend whose greatest opponent turned out not to be another man in the ring, but the damage that followed him outside it, and once that damage entered the public record, the victories could still be remembered, but never again in innocence. Earl Simmons. DMX-born Earl Simmons belongs in this story because his life became one of the clearest examples of how criminal trouble can slowly consume a public legacy from the inside out. Unlike some stars whose downfall is tied to one explosive case, DMX's decline came in waves: arrests, probation violations, drug charges, tax problems, and repeated stints behind bars. That pattern is what makes his story so powerful. His legal troubles were not a side note to his fame. Over time, they became inseparable from it. What makes DMX especially compelling is the contrast. On stage, he was raw, magnetic, and unforgettable. His voice sounded like pain turned into force. Albums like It's Dark and Hell is Hot and then there was X, made him one of the most recognizable figures in rap. But offstage, the chaos never stayed far away. Long before the tax case that later put him in federal prison, his record already included arrests tied to drugs, weapons, driving offenses, animal cruelty, and probation violations. The public was not watching a clean image suddenly collapse. It was watching a gifted man fight battles he kept losing in full view. How many chances can a star receive before the mistakes become the story people remember most? That question sits at the center of DMX's chapter. In 2017, he pleaded guilty to tax fraud, admitting he had failed to pay about $1.7 million in taxes over several years. In 2018, he was sentenced to 1 year in federal prison. That sentence mattered because it confirmed something many fans had feared for years. The turmoil was no longer just personal instability or tabloid noise. It had hardened into a federal case with consequences serious enough to push him even farther from the career he once dominated. That is why DMX fits this title so well. His story is not simply about crime. It is about erosion. Bit by bit, arrest by arrest, sentence by sentence, the legal trouble kept eating into the legend. The talent never disappeared. The pain never disappeared either. And in the end, that may be what makes his story so difficult to shake the feeling that the world was watching someone brilliant burn through his own chances one after another. James Brown. James Brown's story cuts deep because his legal downfall did not happen to a fading name. It happened to a man already cemented as the godfather of soul, a performer whose discipline, stamina, and authority seemed almost superhuman. That image is what makes the collapse so startling. Brown had built a career on command. On stage, every movement looked controlled, every cue precise, every second his to rule. Then, in 1988, the public saw a very different kind of control unravel. The year spiraled fast. Brown was linked to a series of legal troubles involving drugs, weapons, and violence. But the incident that changed everything came in September 1988. After causing panic at an insurance seminar in Augusta, Georgia, he led police on a high-speed chase across Georgia and South Carolina. Authorities said he refused to stop and tried to force police vehicles off the road. The pursuit ended only after officers shot out the tires of his truck. By December 1988, Brown was sentenced to 6 years and 6 months in prison on charges including aggravated assault and failing to stop for police. He was later released on parole in 1991 after serving about 3 years. What shocks people more than a legend? Making mistakes, seeing a man once defined by discipline suddenly look ruled by chaos. That question sits at the center of James Brown's story. His fall felt bigger than an arrest because it shattered the public idea of him. He was not supposed to look unstable. He was supposed to look untouchable. Even after his release, the music remained powerful, but the aura had changed. That is why he belongs here. His case was not just a criminal episode. It was the moment command gave way to disorder and the myth never fully recovered. Young Thug. Young Thug is the right ending for this video because his story feels painfully modern. Unlike some of the names before him, his downfall did not belong to a distant era of tabloids or old courtroom footage. It unfolded in real time across social media headlines, fan debates, and one of the most chaotic criminal cases in recent Georgia history. By the time he was arrested in May 2022, Jeffrey Williams was not just a successful rapper. He was an architect of a sound, a fashion disruptor, and the founder of Young Stoner Life Records. To many fans, he represented reinvention itself. That is why the case hit with such force. The public was not watching a fading star collapse. It was watching a still relevant one get pulled into a legal machine bigger than fame. The charges were severe. Prosecutors indicted Williams under Georgia's anti-racketeering law and accused him of ties to a violent criminal street gang, arguing that YSL was not only a label, but also Young Slime Life. After more than 2 years of legal turmoil and a trial plagued by delays, Young Thug entered guilty pleas to gang, drug, and gun charges in October 2024 and no contest pleas to additional gang and racketeering-related counts. The judge imposed a 40-year sentence structure. The first 5 years were commuted to time served, followed by 15 years of probation. If he completes probation successfully, another 20 years will also be treated as time served. If he violates the terms, he could be ordered to serve them. He was also barred from the metro Atlanta area for much of that probation with limited exceptions and ordered to avoid gang association, submit to drug testing, and perform community outreach. What does it mean when a man who built his name on freedom ends up living under rules strict enough to shape every next move? That is what makes Young Thug such a powerful final chapter. His story is not only about guilt, punishment, or even notoriety. It is about limitation. The artistry is still there. The influence is still there. But the image of total creative freedom is gone. In the end, that may be the sharpest twist of all. A star who once looked impossible to contain is now remembered through the conditions placed on his future. These stories leave behind a hard question: when a celebrity falls, what truly destroys the legacy? The crime itself, the sentence, or the moment? The public can never look at that person the same way again. Some of these men kept their talent. Some even kept their fame. But none of them escaped the shadow of what they did or were accused and convicted of doing. And that is what makes these stories so disturbing. Which case shocked you the most, and whose downfall changed their legacy forever? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Black Excellence List for more powerful stories behind fame, scandal,